Hello guys, welcome to Infinite Stories. Please leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories. Let's get into the story. Daniel Nathan had always dreamed of success, of living a life where he never had to worry about bills, where luxury and comfort surrounded him. Growing up in a modest home, he watched his parents struggle to make ends meet, and he vowed that his life would be different. He studied relentlessly, pushing himself beyond his limits, earning top grades, and securing a degree in finance from one of the country's most prestigious universities. But having a degree wasn't enough. He knew he had to fight for the life he wanted. After months of sending out applications and attending grueling interviews, he finally landed the opportunity of a lifetime, an executive position at Maxwell Enterprises, one of the leading investment firms in the country. It was the break he had been waiting for, and he was ready to prove himself. His first day at Maxwell Enterprises was nerve-wracking yet exhilarating. Walking into the sleek glass building, Daniel felt a rush of excitement. Everything about the place screamed power and wealth, from the polished floors to the expensive suits worn by executives. He was introduced to his colleagues, but he barely took the time to register their names. His mind was focused on one thing: success. He wanted to rise through the ranks, to be among the elite, to be the man people respected. His boss, Mr. Bennett, was a tough but fair man who had built the company from the ground up. "I see potential in you, Nathan," he had said during the interview, his piercing gaze scrutinizing Daniel. "But potential means nothing without results. Show me what you can do." Those words stuck with Daniel, fueling his determination. Daniel wasted no time proving himself. He worked tirelessly, staying late at the office, researching, strategizing, and bringing in new clients. His hunger for success was evident, and soon, he began to make a name for himself. The senior executives started noticing him, and his boss seemed pleased with his progress. Promotions came quickly, and within a short time, he found himself handling major projects. The more he climbed the corporate ladder, the more he became addicted to the power that came with it. He thrived in the fast-paced world of business, loving the adrenaline rush that came with making deals worth millions. He started dressing the part, wearing designer suits, driving luxury cars, and surrounding himself with influential people. However, success came with a price. The long hours, the pressure, and the ruthless competition left little room for personal relationships. He barely had time to visit his parents, and his friendships dwindled. He told himself it was necessary, sacrifices had to be made for greatness. But in rare moments of solitude, he felt an emptiness creeping in, a void he couldn't quite explain. His wealth and power meant nothing if he had no one to share it with. That was when he realized he was missing something crucial: companionship. The thought of marriage had never been a priority, but now, he found himself longing for someone to come home to, someone who would admire his achievements and support him. Little did he know, the path he was about to take would lead him to both love and heartbreak in ways he never imagined. Daniel Nathan had always been a man with big dreams, and now that he had secured a position at Maxwell Enterprises, he was determined to make a name for himself. From the moment he stepped into the company's towering headquarters, he knew he was meant for greatness. He worked tirelessly, often staying late into the night to prove his worth. His colleagues admired his dedication, but some resented how quickly he was climbing the ranks. Mr. Bennett, the company's CEO, took notice of his relentless ambition and strategic mind. Within a year, Daniel had secured his first major promotion, earning himself a corner office with a breathtaking view of the city skyline. He was no longer just another employee, he was a rising star. With success came wealth, and Daniel embraced it without hesitation. He traded in his modest apartment for a penthouse in an exclusive high-rise, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows and a personal rooftop terrace. His wardrobe transformed from budget suits to custom-made Italian designer pieces, and his old sedan was replaced by a sleek, black sports car. The finer things in life became his new normal. He began frequenting the most exclusive clubs, high-end restaurants, and VIP events, where he mingled with business tycoons, politicians, and celebrities. Every weekend was filled with extravagant parties, expensive whiskey, and casual flings with beautiful women who were drawn to his wealth and power. Despite his luxurious lifestyle, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. His parents, especially his mother, often reminded him that money couldn't buy happiness. Success is great, Daniel, she had told him on one of their rare phone calls, but if you have no one to share it with, it will feel empty. His father, a retired schoolteacher, also tried to warn him. Be careful, son. The higher you climb, the harder you fall. But Daniel dismissed their concerns. He was convinced that love could wait. He had worked too hard to slow down now. His focus remained on expanding his influence, making more money, and securing his legacy. As the years went by, Daniel became one of the most powerful executives at Maxwell Enterprises. He had everything he had ever wanted: wealth, status, and influence. But deep down, he was still alone. His relationships were shallow, and his nights were often spent in a cold, empty penthouse. He knew he was admired, even envied, but he wasn't sure if anyone truly cared about him. The thought lingered in his mind, but he brushed it aside. Love was a distraction. He had more important things to focus on, like climbing even higher. However, life had a way of changing course when least expected. Daniel had no idea that soon, his carefully constructed world would begin to shift, setting him on a path he never saw coming. Despite all the wealth and success Daniel had acquired, a strange emptiness began creeping into his life. His days were filled with high-stakes meetings, corporate negotiations, and extravagant networking events, but when he returned home to his luxurious penthouse, he was always alone. The parties and casual relationships that once excited him now felt meaningless. He would sit on his balcony, sipping expensive whiskey, watching the city lights, and wondering if there was more to life than just power and ambition. He had spent years focused solely on his career, believing that money would solve everything. But now, he realized that success without love felt hollow. His parents had always warned him that no amount of money could replace the warmth of a loving family, but he had brushed off their words. Now, as he saw colleagues bringing their spouses to company events, he felt a pang of envy. He noticed how some of the most powerful men in the business world had strong women beside them, partners who supported and grounded them. That was what he was missing. He didn't just want someone to share his bed, he wanted someone to share his life. But finding the right person was a challenge. Most of the women he met were drawn to his wealth and status rather than who he truly was. Determined to change this, Daniel decided it was time to look for a wife, not just any woman, but someone who would love him for who he was, not for what he had. He started paying more attention to the women he met, looking beyond surface beauty and materialistic desires. He wanted someone kind, intelligent, and genuine, a woman who could see past his wealth and love him for the man he was inside. But where would he find her? His usual circle consisted of socialites, models, and businesswomen, none of whom seemed to have the warmth and sincerity he longed for. As time went on, the desire for companionship grew stronger. He started imagining what it would be like to come home to someone who truly cared, to have deep conversations, to build a life with a partner who stood by his side through all of life's ups and downs. Little did he know, fate was about to introduce him to someone who would change his life forever. Someone who would bring warmth into his cold, structured world and challenge everything he thought he knew about love. Daniel had attended countless business meetings and social gatherings, but none had ever led him to something meaningful outside of work. That changed on a rainy afternoon when he stopped by a small, cozy cafe near his office. It was unlike the five-star restaurants he frequented, simple, warm, and filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. As he entered, shaking off the raindrops from his expensive suit, his eyes landed on a woman behind the counter. She had a gentle smile, her auburn hair tied back in a loose ponytail, and there was something genuine and unpretentious about her presence. The cafe was nearly empty, and as he waited for his order, he found himself watching her. She moved gracefully, her hand steady as she prepared drinks, greeting each customer with warmth. He couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to him without any trace of formality or pretense. When she handed him his coffee, their hands brushed briefly, and she laughed. "You look like someone who takes life too seriously," she teased, her green eyes twinkling. He was taken aback. No one had spoken to him so casually in years. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt something stir within him. Curious, he lingered in the cafe longer than necessary, watching her interact with an elderly couple and a few regulars. Unlike the people he usually associated with, she didn't seem driven by wealth or status. He overheard a conversation where she mentioned working at the cafe to help pay for her younger brother's tuition. She wasn't just kind, she was selfless. It was rare for him to meet someone who worked hard not for personal gain but for the sake of others. Something about her fascinated him, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't want to leave. As he walked out into the rain, his mind was still on her. He didn't even know her name, but he knew one thing: he would be coming back. And not just for the coffee. It started with simple visits. At first, he told himself he was just supporting a small business. But soon, the visits became about her. They talked, laughed, and slowly, an unlikely friendship formed. Caroline was different from any woman he had ever known. She wasn't intimidated by his success, nor was she impressed by his wealth. She treated him like an ordinary man, which both frustrated and intrigued him. The more time he spent with her, the more he realized he didn't just want a companion, he wanted her. Their relationship blossomed, and within a year, Daniel knew there was no one else he wanted by his side. His proposal was grand, just like everything else in his life. He rented out an entire rooftop restaurant, filled it with candles and roses, and had a string quartet playing her favorite song. But what mattered most wasn't the extravagance, it was the way Caroline looked at him when she said yes, with love that wasn't tied to his wealth, but to the man he was inside. Their wedding was a spectacle of elegance and love, attended by business elites and close family. Caroline, in a stunning ivory gown, looked breathtaking. As they exchanged vows, Daniel felt something he hadn't in years: peace. He had built an empire, but Caroline was his greatest treasure. He promised to cherish and protect her, believing their love would last forever. But fate had a different plan, one that would test everything they had built. The first few years of their marriage were blissful. They traveled the world, built a beautiful home, and shared dreams of a future filled with love. Caroline brought a warmth to Daniel's life that he never knew he needed. She made their house a home, filling it with laughter, kindness, and simplicity that balanced his fast-paced corporate life. He found himself slowing down, taking time to enjoy the little things: morning coffee together, late-night conversations, and weekend getaways. Though Daniel was still a powerful businessman, he made sure to dedicate time to his wife. They were happy. But as his business empire grew, so did his responsibilities. The demands of running a multimillion-dollar corporation pulled him away from home more often. Late nights at the office became the norm, and business trips extended for weeks. Caroline, ever supportive, never complained. But deep down, a small distance had begun to form between them, one that neither of them noticed at first. It wasn't until their 5th anniversary that Daniel realized how much things had changed. Caroline had planned a surprise dinner, but he arrived home late, exhausted and distracted. The disappointment in her eyes hurt more than he expected. "You're always busy," she whispered that night, her voice laced with sadness. He promised to do better, to make time, but work always found a way to pull him back in. For the first time, cracks appeared in their perfect love story. And soon, those cracks would become fractures. As Daniel's wealth and influence continued to grow, so did his obsession with maintaining his success. He became more engrossed in his work, spending long hours at the office and traveling frequently for business. What once started as a passion had now turned into an all-consuming ambition. Caroline, who had been his anchor and biggest supporter, started feeling like a shadow in her own marriage. She watched as her husband transformed from the loving, attentive man she married into someone she barely recognized. At first, she tried to be understanding. She told herself that Daniel was working hard for their future, that this phase would pass, and things would return to normal. She made excuses for his absence, even when he missed their anniversary dinner, arriving home past midnight with nothing but a half-hearted apology. "It's just temporary," he assured her, pressing a quick kiss to her forehead before collapsing into bed, too exhausted to notice the sadness in her eyes. But as months passed, she realized that Daniel's absence was no longer temporary, it had become the new reality. The small, intimate moments they once shared began to fade. They no longer had late-night talks about their dreams, no more spontaneous weekend getaways, and no more laughter echoing through their home. Daniel was always busy. He buried himself in work, dismissing Caroline's concerns whenever she tried to talk about their growing distance. "I'm doing this for us," he would say, frustration evident in his voice. But Caroline no longer felt like part of his world, she felt like an outsider looking in. As time went on, Daniel became emotionally unavailable. He stopped noticing the little things, the way she looked at him, the way she waited up for him every night, the way she silently longed for the man she fell in love with. Caroline still loved him, but she was beginning to wonder if love alone was enough to hold their marriage together. Something was breaking between them, and she feared it was beyond repair. Daniel had always been surrounded by successful and ambitious people in his corporate world, but none had ever caught his attention the way Tina did. They met at an exclusive corporate gala, a high-profile event filled with powerful business executives and social elites. As Daniel mingled with colleagues, his eyes landed on a striking woman across the room, Tina. She was confident, beautiful, and had an aura of charm that drew people toward her effortlessly. Unlike Caroline, who had always been warm and humble, Tina exuded an air of sophistication and ambition that intrigued him. Tina was a senior executive at one of the most influential marketing firms in the city. She had built her empire through sheer determination and wasn't shy about her achievements. When Daniel was introduced to her by a mutual acquaintance, she greeted him with a captivating smile, her eyes filled with admiration. "I've heard a lot about you, Mr. Nathan. Your business strategies are nothing short of brilliant," she said smoothly, tilting her glass of champagne. Daniel, flattered by the compliment, found himself engaged in a conversation that felt effortless and exciting. Unlike the quiet and predictable life he had with Caroline, Tina represented something thrilling, something new. As the night went on, Daniel found himself drawn to Tina's energy. She spoke passionately about business, success, and power, things that now consumed Daniel's world. He felt an instant connection, as if she understood him in ways Caroline no longer could. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt truly seen, admired, and respected. When the gala ended, Tina subtly placed her business card in his hand. "Call me sometime," she said with a wink before walking away, leaving Daniel standing there, conflicted yet undeniably intrigued. That night, as Daniel drove home, his thoughts were filled with Tina. He didn't realize it yet, but something had shifted. A seed had been planted, a dangerous one. He told himself it was harmless, just a professional connection, but deep down, he knew he was playing with fire. At first, Daniel convinced himself that his interactions with Tina were purely professional. He justified their increasing meetings by telling himself that she was a valuable business connection. But as the days turned into weeks, their conversations became more personal, more intimate. Tina was unlike any woman he had ever met. She challenged him, made him feel powerful, and stroked his ego in ways Caroline never did. Before long, Daniel found himself making excuses to see her more often. Business meetings turned into private lunches, which soon turned into late-night drinks. Each encounter blurred the lines between professionalism and something deeper. Daniel knew he was crossing a line, but he couldn't stop himself. With Tina, he felt alive, powerful, and desired. She admired his success, celebrated his ambitions, and never made him feel guilty for putting work first. One evening, after a particularly successful business deal, Daniel and Tina found themselves alone in a luxury hotel bar. The air between them was thick with tension, unspoken desires simmering beneath the surface. Tina leaned in closer, her voice soft yet confident. "You deserve someone who understands your world, Daniel. Someone who doesn't hold you back." Her words ignited something within him, validation, temptation, and an overwhelming need to escape from the stagnancy of his marriage. That night, Daniel made a decision that would change everything. He kissed Tina. What started as an innocent attraction had now turned into a full-blown affair. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel guilty. Instead, he felt exhilarated. Caroline had always been patient, always understanding. But lately, something felt different. Daniel felt different. He had become distant, emotionally unavailable, and constantly distracted. He no longer shared his thoughts with her, no longer looked at her the way he once did. He was slipping away, and she had no idea why. At first, Caroline tried to ignore the sinking feeling in her chest. She told herself he was just busy, that work was demanding, that it was just a phase. But as time went on, the distance between them became undeniable. Daniel barely came home early anymore. He was always working late, always preoccupied, always somewhere else. When he was home, his mind was elsewhere, his phone constantly buzzing with messages he refused to share. One evening, Caroline finally gathered the courage to confront him. "Daniel, is something wrong? You've been so distant lately. I feel like I don't even know you anymore." She searched his face for a sign of the man she married, for the warmth that once filled their home. But Daniel merely sighed, rubbing his temples. "I've been busy, Caroline. Can't we just drop this?" His words were cold, dismissive, almost as if he didn't care how she felt. Caroline's heart sank. She knew something was wrong, but Daniel wasn't willing to talk. She wasn't sure if she wanted to know the truth or if she was too afraid to face it. But deep down, she knew her marriage was slowly falling apart, and she was powerless to stop it. As Daniel's obsession with work and his newfound social status grew, his treatment of Caroline began to change drastically. Gone were the days when he would come home eager to spend time with her, sharing stories about his day and listening to hers. Now, he barely acknowledged her presence. When she greeted him, he responded with cold indifference. When she tried to discuss their marriage, he dismissed her concerns as trivial. Caroline, who had once been his world, now felt like an unwanted burden. The warmth in his voice had disappeared, replaced by impatience and irritation. He would snap at her for the smallest things: if dinner was served a minute late, if the house was too quiet or too noisy, if she dared to ask about his whereabouts. Each day, she felt herself shrinking under his harsh words, unable to understand why the man who once adored her now treated her like she was invisible. The emotional abuse escalated slowly but painfully. At first, it was small things: ignoring her texts, rolling his eyes when she spoke, staying out late without explanation. But soon, it became deliberate cruelty. He would criticize her cooking, her clothes, even the way she laughed. He would invite his wealthy friends over and act as if she was nothing more than a servant in their home, instructing her to pour drinks while he laughed with his guests. If she spoke, he would cut her off, belittling her opinions. The most painful part was that he didn't even try to hide it anymore. He wanted her to feel unwanted, to feel small. And Caroline did. Every insult chipped away at her spirit, leaving her feeling like a shadow of the woman she once was. One night, after another humiliating evening where Daniel openly flirted with women at a business dinner, Caroline finally gathered the courage to confront him. She waited until they got home, her hands trembling as she asked, "Daniel, why are you treating me this way? What happened to us?" He laughed, a cruel, heartless sound that sent shivers down her spine. "Us?" he scoffed. "There is no us anymore, Caroline. Maybe if you were more interesting, more sophisticated, I wouldn't have lost interest." His words cut through her like a blade. She felt her breath hitch, but she refused to let him see her cry. Instead, she turned away, retreating to their bedroom, where she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the ring on her finger. The same ring that once symbolized love now felt like a shackle, a cruel reminder of a man who no longer saw her as his wife, but as an inconvenience. Caroline's sleepless nights became frequent, her once vibrant spirit dimming under the weight of Daniel's mistreatment. She longed for the days when he would hold her, when he would whisper words of love and promise her forever. But those days were gone, and she was beginning to accept a heartbreaking truth: Daniel no longer loved her. And maybe, just maybe, he never would again. The pain of Daniel's betrayal weighed heavily on Caroline, taking a toll on her body as well as her mind. Sleepless nights turned into exhausted days, and she barely had the strength to go about her daily routine. She could no longer recognize the woman in the mirror, her once bright eyes were dull with sadness, and her body felt weak, as if life itself was slipping away from her. She tried to hide it, forcing herself to smile whenever Daniel was home, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he would notice her suffering and care. But he didn't. He barely looked at her anymore, and when he did, it was with nothing but annoyance. The stress of his neglect began to manifest physically. Caroline suffered from frequent headaches, dizziness, and overwhelming fatigue. She often found herself struggling to keep up with simple tasks: cooking, cleaning, even standing for too long. The once vibrant woman who had loved Daniel with all her heart was slowly fading away. She kept telling herself that things would get better, that she just needed to push through the pain, but deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. She considered seeing a doctor, but Daniel had already made it clear that he had no time for her petty concerns. He had stopped asking if she was okay, stopped caring if she ate or slept. To him, she was nothing more than a forgotten obligation. One evening, Caroline tried to prepare dinner, determined to hold on to any sense of normalcy. She was chopping vegetables when a sharp pain shot through her chest, causing her to gasp and clutch the counter for support. Her vision blurred, and the kitchen spun around her. She struggled to steady herself, but her body refused to cooperate. Within seconds, her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto the cold tiled floor. Darkness consumed her before she could even cry out for help. Daniel wasn't home that night. He had once again chosen to spend his evening with Tina, leaving Caroline alone and vulnerable. Hours passed before anyone found her. It was their housekeeper, Maria, who arrived the next morning and discovered her unconscious on the floor. Panic filled Maria's eyes as she shook Caroline gently, calling out her name. When Caroline barely stirred, Maria wasted no time. She grabbed her phone and called for an ambulance. As paramedics rushed to the scene, Maria couldn't stop the tears that fell from her eyes. She had watched Caroline suffer in silence for months, had seen the way Daniel had discarded her as if she meant nothing. And now, she feared it was too late to save her. The sound of beeping machines and hushed voices filled Caroline's ears as she slowly regained consciousness. Her body felt heavy, as if a great weight was pressing down on her chest. Blinking against the bright hospital lights, she tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through her body, forcing her to remain still. Confusion clouded her mind. Where was she? What had happened? And then, like a flood, the memories came rushing back, the dizziness, the collapse, the cold kitchen floor. A nurse entered the room, offering a warm but concerned smile. "You're awake," she said softly. "You've been through quite an ordeal." Caroline tried to respond, but her throat was dry, and her voice came out as nothing more than a weak whisper. The nurse quickly poured her a glass of water, helping her drink before explaining what had happened. "You collapsed due to extreme exhaustion and stress," she continued. "Your body has been fighting for too long without proper care." Caroline swallowed hard, her chest tightening with emotion she couldn't quite name. How had things gotten this bad? Her thoughts were interrupted when the doctor entered the room, his expression grim. "Mrs. Nathan," he began, glancing at her chart. "We ran several tests after you arrived, and I'm afraid we have some difficult news." Caroline's heart pounded in her chest as she braced herself for the worst. The doctor took a deep breath before continuing, "You have cancer." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, suffocating her. Cancer. The word felt foreign and cruel, a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she struggled to process what this meant. Would she die? Would she ever recover? And most painfully, would Daniel even care? As if on cue, her gaze drifted to the door, half expecting to see her husband rushing in, worried sick about her. But he wasn't there. He hadn't come. The realization struck her like a physical blow. Daniel hadn't even noticed she was missing. A deep ache settled in her chest, but this time, it wasn't just from the sickness. It was from the truth she could no longer deny. She was alone. Completely and utterly alone. The doctor's voice was gentle as he explained the severity of Caroline's condition. "It's in the early stages," he said, trying to offer hope. "With treatment, there's a chance for recovery. But you'll need strong support from your loved ones." Caroline let out a shaky breath, forcing herself to nod. Strong support. She didn't have that. Her husband, the man who had once vowed to stand by her in sickness and in health, was nowhere to be found. The doctor gave her a moment to process the news before continuing, "You need to start treatment as soon as possible. Chemotherapy will be difficult, but it's your best chance." Caroline clenched the sheets beneath her fingers, overwhelmed by fear and uncertainty. How would she do this alone? Would she even survive? The weight of her reality was crushing, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't rely on Daniel. If she was going to fight this, she would have to find the strength within herself. Hours passed, and still, Daniel didn't show up. Maria, the housekeeper, had been the one to call him, but his response had been indifferent. "She'll be fine," he had said before hanging up. Maria had never felt such disgust toward another human being. She watched as Caroline lay in that hospital bed, looking so fragile, so lost, and she made a silent vow: if Daniel wasn't going to be there for her, she would. Someone had to care. As night fell, Caroline stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of the future. She had always believed in love, in marriage, in forever. But now, she saw the truth. Love could be fleeting. Promises could be broken. And the person you trusted the most could be the one to hurt you the worst. A tear slid down her cheek as she whispered into the darkness, "I don't need him." And for the first time, she started to believe it. The days passed, and Caroline remained in the hospital, growing weaker with each session of chemotherapy. The nurses were kind, the doctors were attentive, and Maria, her ever-faithful housekeeper, stayed by her side whenever she could. But Daniel? He was nowhere to be found. Not once had he stepped into her hospital room, not once had he called to check on her. To the world, she was still his wife, but in reality, she was nothing more than an afterthought. Maria tried, time and time again, to reach Daniel. "Sir, your wife is very sick," she had pleaded over the phone. "She needs you." But his responses were always the same, cold, dismissive, and heartless. "I have a lot on my plate right now, Maria. I'll visit when I can." But he never did. Instead, he spent his days and nights wrapped in Tina's arms, living a life of luxury and pleasure while his wife lay in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. Caroline didn't cry anymore. She had exhausted all her tears, had spent too many nights staring at the hospital ceiling, wondering what she had done to deserve this. At first, she had held on to the hope that Daniel would come, that he would realize his mistakes and rush to her side. But as the days turned into weeks, that hope withered away. She finally understood, Daniel had already moved on. She was no longer his priority, no longer the woman he loved. And that realization hurt more than the disease eating away at her body. One evening, Maria brought her a small bouquet of flowers, placing them gently on the bedside table. "From who?" Caroline asked, surprised. Maria hesitated before answering, "From me. I know they're not much, but I just wanted you to know that someone cares." Caroline's heart clenched at the simple yet profound gesture. It wasn't grand or extravagant like the gifts Daniel used to shower her with, but it was genuine. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to smile. Daniel sat in his office, staring at the divorce papers on his desk. His lawyer had already drawn them up, outlining everything in simple, emotionless terms. Caroline would receive a small settlement, nothing more. He had made sure of that. He didn't want any complications, didn't want her illness to be his burden any longer. As far as he was concerned, she was dead weight, and he was ready to move on with Tina. Tina had been growing impatient, constantly pressuring him to finalize things. "You promised me, Daniel," she pouted, tracing a finger down his chest. "I don't want to be your mistress forever. I want to be your wife." Her words ignited something within him, a desire for a fresh start, a life without the baggage of a sickly wife. "You will be," he assured her. "Caroline will sign the papers soon." Little did Daniel know, life had a way of humbling even the most arrogant of men. His empire, built on deception and greed, was already beginning to crack. But he was too blinded by lust and ambition to see it. He was too focused on erasing Caroline from his life to realize that one day, he would regret every decision he was making. Later that evening, he arrived home and found Maria waiting for him. Her expression was filled with barely concealed anger. "Sir, when are you going to see your wife?" she demanded. "She's getting worse." Daniel sighed, already irritated. "That's none of your concern, Maria. Caroline and I will settle things soon." He waved the divorce papers in front of her, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "She won't be my problem for much longer." Tina wasn't satisfied with just words, she wanted action. "What's taking so long, Daniel?" she snapped, crossing her arms. "Just get her to sign the papers already. She's sick, isn't she? She probably doesn't even have the strength to argue." Daniel frowned, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that simple. She might be weak, but Caroline is still stubborn." Tina's patience was running thin. She had waited long enough, and she wasn't about to let Caroline's sickness delay her happily ever after. "If you don't handle this soon, Daniel, I will," she threatened. "I'm not going to wait around forever." Her words sent a chill through him. Tina was beautiful, but she was also ruthless. And he knew she meant every word. That night, Daniel sat in his study, drinking heavily. A part of him felt a twinge of guilt. He hadn't always been this heartless. There was a time when Caroline had meant everything to him. But somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that she was holding him back. That his love for her had been a phase, nothing more. Still, why did the thought of completely cutting her out of his life make him feel uneasy? With a frustrated sigh, he grabbed the divorce papers and headed to the hospital. He was going to end this once and for all. Caroline was asleep when Daniel arrived, her frail body looking smaller than he remembered. The sight of her hooked up to machines made him feel something foreign, discomfort, maybe even guilt. But he quickly pushed those emotions aside. He didn't come here for sentiment. He came to finish what he started. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw him, a flicker of hope crossed her face. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice weak. But the moment he placed the divorce papers on her lap, that hope shattered. "Sign them," he said coldly. "Let's not drag this out." Tears welled up in Caroline's eyes as she stared at the papers. After everything they had been through, after all the years of love and sacrifice, this was how it ended. You really don't care anymore, do you?" she murmured. Daniel didn't answer. He just crossed his arms and waited. With shaking hands, Caroline picked up the pen. She was too weak to fight. Too tired to beg. If this was what he wanted, then fine. But as she signed her name, she made a silent vow she would never forgive him. Not in this life. Not in the next. Caroline sat in the hospital bed, the weight of the divorce papers crushing her spirit. Signing them had taken every ounce of strength she had left, not just physically but emotionally. She had once dreamed of a lifetime with Daniel, of growing old together, of raising children and watching sunsets hand in hand. But those dreams had been shattered by betrayal. Now, all she had left was a name on a piece of paper, a cold reminder that the man she once loved had discarded her like she was nothing. Maria sat by her side, holding her frail hand. "You didn't deserve this," she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. "He doesn't deserve you." But Caroline simply smiled, a sad, resigned smile. "It doesn't matter anymore, Maria," she said softly. "I have to let him go. Holding on to hope will only break me more." She had learned the hard way that love, when given to the wrong person, could be the cruelest weapon. As the hours passed, she stared out of the hospital window, watching as the world continued without her. Somewhere out there, Daniel was probably celebrating with Tina, toasting to his newfound freedom. The thought made her chest tighten, but she refused to cry. Instead, she made a silent vow she would never forgive him. Not in this life. Not in the next. He had made his choice, and now, so had she. A gentle knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. When she turned, she saw a tall, well-dressed man standing in the doorway. His presence was unfamiliar, but there was a kindness in his eyes that made her feel strangely at ease. "Mrs. Nathan?" he asked gently. "My name is Jonathan Williams. I was passing by when I heard about your situation. May I sit with you for a while?" Caroline looked at him in surprise. A stranger, yet somehow, there was something comforting about him. She nodded weakly, and he stepped inside, pulling a chair close to her bedside. "I visit the hospital often," he explained. "I help patients who feel alone, who have no one to turn to." His voice was calm, reassuring, like a gentle wave washing over her battered heart. For the first time in weeks, Caroline felt safe enough to speak. "I thought I had someone," she murmured, her voice laced with pain. "But he left me when I needed him the most." Jonathan studied her carefully before speaking. "Sometimes, losing someone is not the end. It is just the beginning of something better." Tears welled up in Caroline's eyes. She had been so focused on the pain of losing Daniel that she hadn't considered the possibility of a new beginning. But could she truly move on? Could she rebuild herself from the ashes of a broken heart? "I don't know if I have the strength," she admitted. Jonathan reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "You have more strength than you realize," he said with certainty. "And if you allow yourself to heal, you will see that this heartbreak is not your end. It is your rebirth." Caroline exhaled shakily, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirring within her, hope. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of her story. Maybe it was only the beginning. Jonathan sat beside Caroline every day, watching her battle not just cancer but the heartbreak that had almost consumed her. His heart ached for the woman who had been abandoned at her lowest. He had seen many patients struggling in the hospital, but something about Caroline's pain struck him deeply. She wasn't just fighting for her health, she was fighting to believe in life again. He couldn't ignore the way her once bright eyes had dimmed, the way she barely touched her food, as if she had already accepted defeat. Determined to help her, Jonathan made arrangements for Caroline to receive the best treatment possible. He used his wealth to ensure she had access to top oncologists, the latest medical care, and a comfortable place to heal. But more than that, he offered her companionship, something Daniel had cruelly denied her. "You're not alone, Caroline," he would tell her. "You may think you've lost everything, but I promise you, there's still so much ahead of you." She wanted to believe him, but her heart was still shackled by pain. Slowly, under Jonathan's care, Caroline found herself beginning to heal, not just physically, but emotionally. He encouraged her to talk, to cry, to release the pain she had bottled up for so long. She found comfort in his words, in his unwavering support. And for the first time in months, she felt something she thought she had lost forever: hope. Still, in the back of her mind, she knew Daniel was living a life of luxury with Tina, celebrating his freedom while she struggled to survive. The thought of him no longer brought tears, though. It brought a quiet determination. She would live, not for him, not to prove anything to him, but for herself. While Caroline was rebuilding herself, Daniel was basking in the life he thought he had always wanted. His wedding to Tina was extravagant, a display of wealth and power. The media hailed them as the perfect power couple, their pictures splashed across magazines, their love story celebrated as if it were something grand. Daniel looked at his new wife with satisfaction, believing he had finally upgraded. Caroline had been weak, a burden. Tina, on the other hand, was ambitious, glamorous, and ready to take on the world with him. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Tina was not the devoted woman Caroline had been. She had expensive tastes, an insatiable hunger for luxury, and little patience for Daniel's moments of stress. When he had been with Caroline, he had felt secure, loved. With Tina, everything felt like a transaction. She stayed as long as the money flowed. Still, Daniel ignored the nagging feeling in his gut. He had no reason to look back. Caroline was gone from his life, and he was thriving. Or so he thought. He had no idea that his empire was built on a foundation of deceit and corruption, that the walls were already closing in on him. The fall he had never imagined was already on its way. Meanwhile, Caroline was not the broken woman he had left behind. She was fighting, stronger than ever. Determined to reclaim her life, Caroline threw herself into her treatment. The chemotherapy sessions were grueling, the pain sometimes unbearable, but she refused to give up. With Jonathan by her side, she found strength she didn't know she had. He prayed for her, encouraged her, and reminded her daily that she was more than her suffering. She began to see the world differently. She had spent so long living in Daniel's shadow, believing her worth was tied to his love. But now, she saw the truth: she had always been enough. She had been a loving wife, a devoted partner, and she had never deserved the pain he inflicted on her. That realization fueled her fight. Months passed, and though the journey was painful, Caroline slowly began to recover. The woman who had once been fragile and broken was now filled with fire. She started to dream again, to envision a future where she wasn't a victim but a survivor. And for the first time, she thought of Daniel not with sorrow, but with indifference. He had no power over her anymore. When her doctor delivered the news that the cancer was finally in remission, Caroline wept, not from sadness, but from triumph. She had survived. She had won. And now, it was time to live. The day Caroline received her final test results, confirming that she was officially cancer-free, she felt like she had been reborn. She stood before the mirror, touching her reflection with awe. She was thinner, her hair had not fully grown back, but her eyes shone with a strength she had never seen before. She was no longer the same woman Daniel had abandoned. She was stronger, wiser, and she had found something far more valuable than his love: her own self-worth. Jonathan was the first person she called. He arrived at the hospital, a proud smile on his face. "I told you," he said gently, "this was only the beginning for you." Caroline smiled through her tears. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You saved me." Jonathan shook his head. "No, Caroline. You saved yourself." As she stepped out of the hospital for the first time in months, she breathed in the fresh air, feeling lighter than she ever had before. The weight of Daniel's betrayal, the pain of the past, it was all behind her now. She was free. And the future was finally hers to shape. Little did she know, while she was celebrating her new life, Daniel's was about to come crashing down. Daniel's downfall began subtly, almost unnoticeably. His company, once thriving, started facing financial inconsistencies. Investors who once trusted him without question began pulling out, citing concerns about mismanaged funds. At first, Daniel dismissed the warning signs, too preoccupied with his lavish lifestyle and his new wife, Tina. He had built an empire on ambition, but what he failed to realize was that ambition without integrity was a ticking time bomb. Then came the audit. The government had been investigating his company for months, following a trail of fraudulent activities that had gone unnoticed for years. Daniel had manipulated financial reports, hidden illegal transactions, and embezzled money to maintain his extravagant life. The evidence was undeniable, and soon, law enforcement came knocking at his door. The day they arrived, Tina was nowhere to be found. She had caught wind of the investigation and had already started distancing herself, no longer interested in a man whose fortune was crumbling. Daniel was arrested in the middle of a business meeting, humiliated in front of the executives who once admired him. The news spread like wildfire. Daniel Nathan, once a celebrated businessman, arrested for fraud. The same media that had once praised his success now feasted on his downfall. He was denied bail, forced to sit in a cold prison cell as he awaited trial. And for the first time in his life, Daniel felt true fear. Everything he had taken for granted, his wealth, his power, his freedom, was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As he sat in his cell, Daniel's mind wandered to Caroline. He had once seen her as weak, disposable. But now, as he faced the consequences of his actions, he realized she had been the strongest person he had ever known. She had endured his betrayal, his cruelty, and yet she had survived. And him? He was nothing. Tina wasted no time severing ties with Daniel. The moment the news of his arrest hit the media, she packed her bags and disappeared. She had never been in love with Daniel, she had been in love with his wealth, his status, the luxurious life he had provided. And now that he had nothing, she had no reason to stay. Within days, rumors spread that Tina had moved on to another wealthy businessman, someone even richer than Daniel had been. Daniel read about it from his prison cell, unable to believe how quickly she had discarded him. The same woman he had sacrificed his marriage for, the woman he had chosen over the wife who had loved him unconditionally, had abandoned him without a second thought. Betrayal tasted bitter, but the worst part was the regret. If only he had been wiser, if only he had realized that Tina was never his salvation but his destruction. He had left a woman who had given him everything for a woman who had only wanted to take. Now, he was alone, with no money, no power, and no love. As he lay on his prison bed, staring at the ceiling, he wondered if Caroline had heard about his downfall. Did she feel sorry for him? Or did she laugh at his misery? The thought haunted him, but deep down, he knew the truth. Caroline was no longer thinking about him at all. Prison was a nightmare Daniel had never imagined for himself. He had been a man who once dictated the fate of others, who had people at his beck and call. Now, he was just another inmate, stripped of his identity, forced to endure the same routine day after day. The luxury he had once surrounded himself with was gone, replaced by cold, hard walls and the harsh reality of his mistakes. His fellow inmates had no respect for him. To them, he was just another corrupt businessman who had finally gotten what he deserved. He was bullied, humiliated, forced to do things he never thought he would. And worst of all, he had no one on the outside who cared enough to check on him. No family, no friends. He had burned every bridge, and now, he was paying the price. With nothing else to do, Daniel spent his days reflecting on his past. He thought about the way he had treated Caroline, the way he had discarded her as if she were worthless. And yet, she had survived. She had rebuilt herself. He, on the other hand, had fallen into ruin. The irony was unbearable. One night, as he lay in his bunk, he whispered a single thought to himself: I have to see her. I have to ask for her forgiveness. It was the only thing left that mattered. Years passed, and eventually, Daniel was released from prison. But freedom was not the victory he had hoped for. The world had moved on without him. His company was gone, his wealth was gone, and the high society friends who had once praised him now avoided him like a plague. He had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. With what little money he had left, he rented a tiny, run-down apartment in the outskirts of the city. Every day, he struggled to find work, but no one wanted to hire a disgraced businessman. He wandered the streets, watching as people lived their lives, realizing that he was now just a forgotten man. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, his thoughts drifted to Caroline once more. He had tried to forget her, but she remained the one person he couldn't erase. She had suffered because of him, yet she had found a way to rise. He had to see her, even if she hated him. He needed to apologize, even if it was too late. With nothing left to lose, he decided to seek her out. The day Daniel finally gathered the courage to face Caroline, the weight of his past mistakes sat heavily on his shoulders. He had lost everything: his wealth, his reputation, and even his will to live. The once proud businessman, who had held the world in his hands, was now nothing more than a broken man, desperate for redemption. As he walked towards Caroline's house, his legs felt weak, but he pressed on, clinging to the hope that she would at least listen to him. He had rehearsed his words 100 times, but as he stood at her doorstep, all he could feel was overwhelming shame. When the door opened, Daniel's breath hitched. Caroline stood before him, more radiant than he had ever seen her. Her eyes, once filled with pain, now held only quiet confidence. She was no longer the fragile woman he had abandoned. She was strong, healed, and completely out of his reach. For a moment, Daniel couldn't speak. His throat tightened as he realized that she had not just survived without him, she had thrived. Caroline, he finally managed, his voice trembling. I know I don't deserve it, but please, forgive me. He fell to his knees, tears spilling down his face, his once pristine suit now wrinkled and worn from years of struggle. Caroline looked down at him, her face unreadable. She had imagined this moment before, wondering if he would ever feel the pain he had inflicted upon her. Now that it was happening, she felt no satisfaction, no desire for revenge, only indifference. She let out a soft sigh, shaking her head. Daniel, you made your choices. You threw me away like I was nothing, and now you expect me to welcome you back with open arms? Her voice was calm, steady, but it carried the weight of everything she had endured. I told you before, I would never forgive you. Not in this life, not in the next. Daniel's shoulders shook as he sobbed, clutching the fabric of her dress like a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. Please, Caroline. I have nothing left. I was a fool. I lost everything because of my greed. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I destroyed it. If I could take it all back, I would. But his words meant nothing now. Caroline gently pulled away, stepping back into the warmth of her home, the home she had built without him. Goodbye, Daniel, she said softly before closing the door, leaving him alone in the cold night, forever haunted by the echoes of his own regret. 1 year later, Caroline stood in a breathtaking garden, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. Flowers bloomed in vibrant colors, their fragrance filling the air as soft music played in the background. This was the day she had dreamed of, not the lavish wedding she once had with Daniel, built on illusions, but a union founded on love, trust, and genuine happiness. Today, she was marrying Jonathan, the man who had stood by her side when she had nothing, the man who had taught her that real love was patient and kind. As she walked down the aisle, her heart swelled with emotion. The guests, her true friends, her newfound family, smiled warmly at her, and at the end of the aisle stood Jonathan, his eyes filled with unwavering devotion. He had been her light in the darkest times, her pillar of strength when she felt she had none left. He had never asked for anything in return, never treated her like a burden. He had simply loved her for who she was. And now, she was ready to love him with everything she had. As she reached him, he took her hands gently, his touch warm and reassuring. The officiant began the ceremony, but Caroline hardly heard the words. All she could focus on was the man standing before her, the future they were about to build together. When it was time to say their vows, her voice was steady, filled with conviction. Jonathan, you found me at my lowest and lifted me up when I had no strength left. You showed me what true love is, not one built on wealth or status, but on kindness, patience, and unwavering support. I promise to love you, to cherish you, and to stand by your side for the rest of our lives. Jonathan squeezed her hands, his own eyes misty with emotion. Caroline, you are the strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. You have shown me what it means to love selflessly, to fight even when the world tries to break you. I vow to love you endlessly, to always put you first, and to walk beside you through every joy and every storm. As they exchanged rings, sealing their promises with a kiss, a sense of peace washed over Caroline. She had finally found the love she deserved. There was no fear, no hesitation, only the certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Somewhere, in the depths of his loneliness, Daniel might have been thinking of her, wishing he could turn back time. But Caroline had no space in her heart for regrets. She was looking forward, stepping into a future filled with love, happiness, and the promise of a new beginning. That's the end of the story. What did you learn about the story? Please leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories. Thanks for watching.